there are a lot of system functions that we can use in scripting. And what our boss would like us to do is modify that last query by adding a row count, basically to display a message if nothing was updated. So we're going to add task number 4. We're going to take our closing comment and move it down. And we're going to copy this entire query. And then after the fetch next, we're going to check the row count system variable to see if it's equal to 0, because that would indicate nothing got processed. And then we're going to print warning, no rows were updated. That would be a really good thing to know. All right. And let's go ahead and run this again. And we don't really need to worry about the invoice total getting another 6% added, because remember, we are putting it into a temporary table, and it's going to drop the current temporary table and create a new one. Now let's look at our messages. All right, so it dropped the current temporary table, created a new one. And then you can see that it's updated. And then at the very bottom, I would expect that it did not update, because there would be nothing there. Yeah, for the last one, it's going to have nothing to update. Okay, so that's where we're seeing the warning, and that's exactly what we would expect, right? So when it hits the end of the rows, the row count is going to be 0, and nothing is going to be updated. Okay, so let's move that closing comment down. And we'll hit save. And there's one more thing our boss would like us to do. They want us to add records or rows to the vendor and invoices table in the AP database using row count and identity system functions. So identity, at identity, gives you the primary key. And we already know what row count does. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be inserting into vendors, and we're going to be storing that primary key using at identity to retrieve it. And then once we have a vendor, we can create an invoice for the vendor. And if you remember, vendor ID is a foreign key. Okay, so we're going to be retrieving the ID from vendors and then using it in our insert statement for invoices. So I'm going to pause this while I enter the script. So this is kind of a short script, but there is a lot going on here. So we're using our AP database. We're declaring an identity variable and a count variable. So the identity variable is going to be storing the primary key for vendors. And if we take a look at the AP database, whoops, not there. And we expand out vendors. And we look at vendor ID, which is the primary key. It is an integer, and that is why we are using integer here. And row count is an integer, right? It's just counting the number of rows. Okay, so we are inserting into vendors, and we're starting with vendor name because ID is automatically generated. Okay, so we are inserting all of this data into vendors. Then we're using @ identity to retrieve that vendor ID. And we're storing that in the variable that we created called my identity. And then we're storing the row count in my row count. Because we want to make sure that this vendor got processed. Okay, so then we're checking the row count to see if it is equal to 1. If it's equal to 1, that means this vendor was added to the system. And because they're in the system, we can now create an invoice for them. So as long as the row count is equal to 1, we can insert into invoices. We're going to be using the vendor ID that we got from @ identity. And then we're giving it the rest of the information required for invoices. So if we look at invoices, we are not giving it an invoice ID because that's automatically generated. So vendor ID is stored in @my identity. And then we've got invoice number, then we've got invoice date, all of that information. And I'm actually going to use a more current invoice date. There we go. And I think we'll do a more current invoice due date. Makes sense, right? There we go. And if row count is not a 1, which means the vendor could not be inserted, then we're just going to display a message that the row wasn't inserted into invoices. And basically the reason that we didn't insert it is because we have no vendor ID. Okay, we have to have that vendor ID in order to insert it. So we are going to go ahead and run this. Okay, so this indicates everything worked. 1 row affected, that got inserted. We came down here. Row count would have been 1 because it was able to insert there. We do not see the error message, so everything worked. And at this point, you are going to save all your changes.